Jim is our final speaker, and I think you're just going to be enthralled with his talk because he's not just giving you history, he's talking about history he actually lived, history he was involved in. And I think that it just makes a wonderful presentation. And also, too, I really got to know Jim by reading his book, Here and Now. And it is a chronicle of his work in the civil rights and his life and dedication to equality and all of the many things he's done, and also his personal side as a family man. So I think without further ado, I really want you to meet, to greet, and enjoy and learn a lot of what Jim has to say. Thanks so much. And he's not short.
Thank you very much, and thank you for coming. And this makes me, I guess, officially part of history. I've lived through 1/3 of our nation's history since the Constitution. I've seen a lot of things, and I've read about the other 2/3. So let me introduce myself. I was a civil rights worker in Southwest Mississippi, 1965, 1966, a civil rights lawyer in Jackson and Oxford, Mississippi, 1966 through 1973, a law school teacher in North Carolina, 1974, 1977, a trial attorney for the Civil Division of the United States Department of Justice in Washington, 1977, 1983. Then I came here with my family, my wife and 3 children, and became an assistant United States attorney here in Springfield, 1983 to 2010. And then in 2010, President Obama nominated me, and the Senate, I guess they weren't too careful, they confirmed me, and I served as United States Attorney here, 2010, 2016, and now I'm retired, which means I work just as hard as I ever did, but I'm an active volunteer for many, many purposes, including this African American History Museum. So thank you very much for coming and being here today at the museum. We're here to think together and talk together about civil rights and the law, including my 2 years as a civil rights worker and my 7 years as a civil rights lawyer in Mississippi. Since we're talking about civil rights, and we're here in Springfield, Illinois, we know a logical place to start, Abraham Lincoln. And my great-grandmother, Henrietta Harris, was born in 1850 in New York, and she claimed that when she was young, she saw Abraham Lincoln. And I knew my great-grandmother because she was still alive in her 90s when I was just a little boy. Yes, I'm trained as a lawyer, and I like verification, and I cannot verify her claim, but her claim that she saw Lincoln is now part of our family history. And like many of us here today, and like many people in Springfield, I've been in Lincoln's home on 8th Street, and his office on 6th Street, and his tomb at Oak Ridge Cemetery. And I've been in the old state capitol many times where he served several roles: legislator, lawyer, arguing cases, president-elect. And like many people in Springfield, I've actually met Lincoln myself many times, although I've come to suspect, and maybe it's my legal training, that the Lincolns that I've met, that we've all met, are not actually Lincoln himself, but they're instead reenactors. In 2014, I spoke at the old state capitol as the keynote speaker for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and Lincoln himself, or was it Randy Duncan, dressed in buckskin to look like Lincoln, came by to listen. That evening in 2014, I talked with Lincoln, or Randy Duncan, about his idea expressed in Alton in 1858 during a debate with Stephen Douglas, that the founders of our country sought to recognize, quote, the happiness and value of life to all people of all colors everywhere, unquote. All people of all colors everywhere. Now, that is, of course, a rather optimistic view of our country's founders, but that's a discussion for another day. But that evening in 2014, I turned and spoke directly to Lincoln, or Randy Duncan, as part of my prepared remarks when I described how our country got from his death in 1865 to 1964, how our country got to that extremely important Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then in 2017 or 2018, I listened to Lincoln, or it may have been Fritz Klein, dressed like Lincoln, talk at length at the Lincoln Presidential Library about his Gettysburg Address. And I asked Lincoln, or Fritz Klein, about the origin of his powerful phrase, of the people, by the people, for the people. So perhaps we might start with our friend Abraham Lincoln. But I believe that we should start earlier if we're going to discuss civil rights. We could start in August 1619, when a Portuguese trading ship, the Golden Horn, arrived in the Virginia colony, needed supplies, and traded some enslaved people from Africa for those supplies. Again, I'm trained as a lawyer and I don't have verification, but I know in my heart, and we all know in our hearts, that these enslaved people wanted the civil right, the human right, to be free, and the civil right, the human right, to be at home with family. And we also know, when we reflect on these enslaved people and the millions of enslaved people who followed and built the Southern economy and sent cotton to the North, which built our Northern economy and our national economy, we also know that these enslaved people never received the civil right, the human right of an honest wage for honest work. So perhaps we could start in 1619. But I think you can see where I'm going. We start much earlier. Perhaps when Cain denied Abel his civil right, his human right, to live his life in peace. Perhaps when Adam and Eve ate the fruit that was forbidden, learned about good and evil, and became mortal and human. So let's start at the very beginning. Civil rights are human rights. It is that simple. Civil rights are human rights. Let me talk about that. Humans evolved to have eyes and ears and voices. They can see and hear each other, and the first civil right and the first civil obligation may be the right and obligation to see each other and hear each other and speak with each other and respect each other. Humans also evolved to have hearts and minds, and the first civil right and the first human obligation may be the right and obligation to hold each other in our hearts and minds, to care for one another, and to use our gifts, our hearts and minds, to come together and find the best way forward. And humans also evolved to have hands so that they can exercise their civil right and human obligation to lend a helping hand to each other when there's a need or when it's simply time for a hand in friendship. So perhaps that's the real origin of civil rights, of human rights, all the way back to the beginning of human existence, well before Lincoln, well before the enslaved people who began to arrive in 1619 in our new world, as we called it, well before the new people in our new world met the native people who had been here for several thousand years before. But today, I'm going to start in September 1966, when I walked into the office of the Lawyers Constitutional Defense Committee, LCDC, in Jackson, Mississippi, to go to work, to be a civil rights lawyer. My first legal job right after I graduated from law school. Now, I already knew the lawyers at LCDC because LCDC represented 50 people, including me, when we were all arrested for a peaceful voting rights protest in Magnolia, Mississippi in February 1965. And that's this picture. There I am with glasses and hair with 50 friends. We're all kneeling and we're all being arrested. LCDC represented us, and then LCDC represented 800 people, including me, when we were all arrested in Jackson, Mississippi in a peaceful voting rights protest in June 1965. 800 of us went to jail and imprisonment together. 800 of us came out of jail and imprisonment together 12 days later, dirty, smelly, but proud that we had exercised our civil right, our human right, to protest the injustice in Mississippi. We were ready to continue our civil rights struggle, our human struggle, determined to continue the struggle to the end. So I was a client for LCDC before I walked in their office and became a lawyer for LCDC. What was the first thing that LCDC asked me to work on? The right to vote. In support of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, the MFDP, a political party, an organization that was created as a voice for the African American community, since Mississippi's Democratic Party and Mississippi's Republican Party did not seem to have room for African American participation. In 1965, 1966, and 1967, thanks to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, Mississippi added perhaps 200,000 new African American voters. That's a lot of new voters, thanks to the Voting Rights Act. So in 1967, Mississippi had the first genuinely desegregated elections in the 20th century. I went around the state for LCDC and for the Freedom Democratic Party and did 20 workshops with Freedom Democratic leaders and Freedom Democratic candidates, explaining the legal power, the power for good in the offices that people sought, sheriff, county supervisor, all the offices. We had to prepare poll watchers for these first genuinely desegregated elections. So I wrote and circulated a booklet for poll watchers on voting law and procedure, from vote registration through the voting process through counting votes. Every detail that a poll watcher might possibly need to know. And I trained and supervised 300 poll watchers who came from outside Mississippi. Robert Clark won election to the state legislature in 1967, the first African American who won a seat in the state legislature since Reconstruction. Robert Clark was challenged. The person he beat did not like losing. So I, with another LCDC lawyer, represented Robert Clark, and we got him seated. And he served many years with distinction. Many other African Americans followed him into the legislature, into the courts, which were elected, into county and local offices, and into the United States Congress. Benny Thompson, who you see on TV, was a student of mine when I taught at Tougaloo. And the state of Mississippi now has more African American elected officials than any other state. And you know that it took risk, sacrifice, and struggle to get where we are now, and it will take risk, sacrifice, and struggle to get where we need to be. So what does a civil rights lawyer do? Protect the right to vote for every person, every election, every time, every county. Every person, every election, every time, every county. In 1970, I left LCDC and moved to Oxford, Mississippi, and became the executive director of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. We were in the midst of truly desegregating 30 school districts. I tried some of these cases leading to genuine school desegregation, more than in other parts of the country. So what does a civil rights lawyer do? Protect the right of young people, every young person, to genuine and equal opportunity for education and a good start in life. Equal opportunity for education, a good start in life. And all along at LCDC and Legal Services, we protected the right to peaceful assembly, peaceful protest, protected by the First Amendment. We represented people who exercised this right and got arrested, just as I had been arrested among hundreds of protesters. We got people out of jail promptly, out of prison promptly. We defended them, and we got the charges dropped. So what does a civil rights lawyer do? Protect the Constitution, protect people's constitutional rights, defend people who have done something that is clearly right, assembling for what was right, protesting against what was wrong. So this should briefly explain what civil rights lawyers do. They head toward people who could really use some help, and they provide that help so that people will have the basic human right to vote, the basic human right to assemble and to protest, the basic human right to an education that will prepare young people for full participation within a shared human community. And that was our simple purpose: basic legal support to people who were asking for and demanding that we all recognize and protect and ensure the humanity, the full humanity of everyone. Now, I've given you a short summary that I've written about the First Amendment, 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment. It's not on the test. There is no test. It includes the civil rights laws that were passed in the decade after the Civil War. Yes, they enacted several good civil rights laws soon after the Civil War. But the 19th century Supreme Court ruled many of these laws to be unconstitutional. And you have a summary of the civil rights laws that were passed in the 1960s. These were ruled to be constitutional, and we have more civil rights laws in the decades that followed. Please take the summary with you and think about it. So let's have a discussion, and I'm going to begin the discussion by asking myself the first two questions. First question: why did I go to Mississippi? To be a civil rights worker, to be a civil rights lawyer. Why was that the only job I applied for when I finished law school in June 1966? And I think that may be the wrong question. Perhaps the right question should be, why didn't everyone choose that work at that place at that time? Since the issue was human rights, and we're all human, quite definitely human. Well, why did I choose to work for civil and human rights? Several reasons. I wanted to get out of my protected cocoon. I wanted to become part of the real world. I wanted to be an active participant in community, in life, and in human struggle toward the human good. I wanted to become a decent person, a useful person. I wanted to exercise my fullest citizenship, and I wanted everyone else to be able to exercise their fullest citizenship. I wanted to use my eyes, my ears, my voice, my heart, my mind, my hands, all with a sense of purpose. I cared. So I made my choice to work for civil rights, human rights. Second and last question: can we ever step away from civil rights work, human rights work? I think you know from what I've said the answer. We can never step away from civil rights work and human rights work if we are human, since we are human. We have eyes and ears and a voice and a heart and a mind and hands, the gifts that come with being human. And we really have no choice but to use these gifts actively, fully within our neighborhoods, community, state, nation, and world. We must do this work if we are human, since we are human. So thank you, and let's open this up for discussion.